Hello, and welcome to State of the Revolution. Today is the last Friday before November 6th, when we have the midterm elections that we've all been working up to. So today on State of the Revolution, we're going to have a free-form conversation on what's at stake in this election. Joining me for the conversation are Tanya Reza, a board member of the Michigan Democratic Party Progressive Caucus and an organizer with Michigan for Revolution, and Amanda Dolinski, secretary of the Progressive Caucus and a board member of Michigan for Single Payer. So we've had quite a 2 years, actually more like 4 since Trump started running. And the Republican Party slowly aligned behind him to the point where now they want it to be a referendum on Trump's presidency across the country. And on the other hand, we have the Democratic Party, which has, from the top down, resisted a lot of the Sanders energy and momentum that was brought into the party in the 2016 election, and did a lot of dem-entering. Both there's a dem-enter organization, there's Michigan for Revolution, who's has that as part of our strategy. So the question is, for us as we see it from our perspective, what's at stake in this election? What are the key things that that we really think this is about, both in terms of individual races and the broader picture? So why don't we start out with some of the more individual races? Are there any particular races that you two are looking at, thinking about specifically, and or excited about for this cycle?
Okay.
Who wants to go?
Well, there are a few. I'm definitely looking nationwide. I'm really excited about Stacey Abrams. I'm really excited about Andrew Gillum in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Really excited about Beto O'Rourke in Texas. I know that Alexandria probably doesn't have much of a challenge coming up in the general, but that was definitely exciting. So, but within Michigan, Sam Bagenstos and Megan Kavanaugh, just both of them getting onto the Michigan State Supreme Court would be tremendous, and we would be flipping the court.
Right.
I'm excited about Dana Nessel,
Okay.
for sure. And I think it's about time we had an attorney general who's really about the people, and I believe that Dana is truly going to be that person. And so those are a few that I'm really excited about. I'm also excited about a lot of the local candidates who've just kind of stepped out. They have had substantial life and professional experiences, but they have not been insiders, I guess. So I know that, for example, like Lori Pohutsky, I'm not sure what district number she's in, but that's exciting. And then I'm trying to think of a few others that have come up, but I guess I was really caught up in that whole primary, which was exciting. And even though a lot of folks lost it's still exciting to see that a few of those folks have made it through. Rob Davidson on the west side of the state.
Deion Adams.
Yeah.
And is he in the 102nd? Do I recall that correctly?
I don't remember the number. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm really, those numbers are
right. I think it is Deion Adams. I think it's 102nd. Could somebody look that up for us back there?
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah. So these are just sort of
Right. I was also going to mention actually here in Lansing where we're filming. Samantha Wilbur's running for Lansing Community College.
Yep.
Trustee. So
yeah, I just donated to her campaign yesterday.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
So what's at stake this election? What's not at stake
Okay.
is probably the shorter list. We have a president that is completely incompetent. He talks about, he lies all the time, and he incites fear within his base. I grew up, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. Words are hurting us, and they have been for the past 3 years. And I say 3 years because it's ever since he decided to run. Can't even say his name. Number 45, I think is a popular term for him in our circles. But it's our democracy that's at stake. For me, I live in the 8th district, so I live right here in Lansing. Well, Hazlitt, Meridian Township, but I'm part of Ingham County. And I was really involved in the primaries, and I was more excited about the candidates, I guess you could say, in the primaries. And none of the candidates I was supporting in the primaries made it on. But what I am really excited about, kind of what's happening right now, is this women's movement. We have a lot of female candidates. You look at our 8th district ballot, and the only male that's on the ballot just for our district is someone who's running unopposed. And he was running unopposed in the primary. So it just seemed like women just kind of swept this district, which is, I think, pretty exciting that we have that. When I've been out canvassing, I'm like, look at all these women. You know, we've got the Me Too movement behind us. We've got the Women's March and the women's movement. So maybe I think that's where we're kind of making progress. And I think that with this election, that's what we're going to see, is we're going to see a lot of women win seats. And I think we're actually going to see more than 50% women win this election.
But that's still not going to get us to anything close to a 50% female legislature or female governors across the country, or Senate members, et cetera. So that's those are all steps in the right direction, and we need to see more of it, because the more of it we see now, the more of it we're going to see later. It's it's a progressive accumulation. But I also, I think we can talk about all of the problems with Trump, and I will say his name because I'm not, I think we need to name the problem. I guess 45 is okay too. But the point is that we can't. One of the things that we ought to have learned, I think, from the 2016 election is that you can't win just by being against the other side. You have to win by having things that you're for that people recognize as being in their corner.
And that's a really good point. I saw an article just yesterday that said that early voting in Georgia and Texas are up by 500%, over 500% in younger generations.
Right.
And I'm looking at, because you kind of stole my candidates that I'm excited about. Stacey Abrams.
I think I stole everyone's candidates.
Stacey Abrams, I mean, I am so jealous that I don't get a chance to vote for her, because she's just such an inspiration. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, Democratic Party, take a look at what's happening in Georgia and Texas. Why do you think that early voting is up in the younger generation? Has nothing to do with the establishment. It has everything to do with these progressive candidates that are running. It's somebody that these people can be excited about voting for. Right,
and let's not forget that it was only a few months ago that we heard about was it Steny Hoyer that went out to Colorado and tried to, get the progressive candidate to knock out of the race, and there was a whole, and Pelosi said, and that should be doing that. That's an okay thing to do. And I think just what we're seeing and what you're describing, this energy among the really 18 to 29, 18 to 35 cohorts. That's behind the progressive movement, and people like Pelosi and Hoyer need to understand that, no offense to either of you, however much I may disagree with your policies, but on this particular issue, you got to let the young people stand up, and it's not just young people, actually. It's really a progressive movement that spans generations and crosses lots of barriers that have not been crossed in politics recently. So what do you, what do you think about sort of the other side of that argument, where some people are not so happy with Ocasio-Cortez, for example, because of some of the things that she's said since then? Now, let me be perfectly honest. I don't recall the exact details of that controversy. Do you know what that was about?
I don't recall the details.
Okay.
Either,
Yeah.
I don't know what
No, there was
I
some.
just know that people are really excited about her.
No, I knew that there were people were excited about her, and then some people were saying that she had backed off on some of her rhetoric, or she had, been, a little bit co-opted.
Yeah.
Andrew Gillum actually did that in his CNN debate.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys watched that, but there was a debate between him and DeSantis, actually on CNN, and he was a champion for Medicare for All in the primary.
Right.
And it was something that he ran on, and he refused to say during the debate that he supported Medicare for All. He kept talking about, no, I'm for Medicaid expansion. I'm for Medicaid expansion. And I'm just like, but I see what you're saying. Maybe Ocasio-Cortez, I haven't heard that, but it seems like that's what's happening is like, I don't know. I think they're being told that you can't win unless you appeal to the moderate. And this is still the conversation that, and the advice that's being given to these progressive candidates. So like, okay, you've won your progressive base since you've won your primary. Now you have to win over the moderates. And they're saying that using like Medicare for All is somehow going to hurt you.
Right.
When more than like 51% of the entire population, and I'm not just talking Democrats, over 70% of Democrats support single payer health care.
Right.
So, Amanda, speaking to your point, now the issue is, again, we don't want to put everything on one candidate, right? And we've seen that, again, like these candidates are operating within a certain medium, and they're subject to all kinds of pressures.
Sure.
So we need to have a movement basically on the ground behind these candidates so they can accomplish their goals. Now, if we're looking at once these candidates join Congress or their state houses, they become part of the establishment. And they're subject to the voices of that establishment, which at the end of the day is still fed largely by corporate interests and moneyed interests. And so we have to make sure that they have the support on the ground behind them for the policies, the more progressive policies that they're trying to pursue.
Right.
So.
Right. So, and I think it's not just putting it on, not just about not putting it on one candidate, but also not putting it on the whole on the whole slate of progressive candidates. You consider the progressive candidates across the country. This is the first major push for a movement that recognizes that what we're after is progress, and progress isn't about the results of one election. Progress is about the direction of results over a number of election cycles, while individual candidates, as they come up into the areas where the establishment has a lot of speaking time, people are influenced by the things around them, whether they're progressives or establishment people or conservatives or whatever it is. And that's a natural human reaction. And it's also true that once you're in that milieu, if you want to get something done, you have to negotiate with people. Absolutely. Okay? So, so we should expect, as a movement, we should expect that there will be some of this pushback, whether it's Gillum in Florida, or Ocasio-Cortez, or even Bernie Sanders, or anybody else that makes it into that situation where they have to have those negotiations. There are going to be situations where this is what we can do, and let's do that, and okay, then we know that we're still coming back the next time. And that's a different way of thinking about politics, okay, than we've been used to. And I really think that's one of the key things that's at stake in this election, is how we perceive what happens and what comes next. Because the establishment will try to say, well, look how many we won and look how few you guys won. Well, you've been at this for 150 years and built the systems to make it difficult for people that don't already agree with, with the people in power to get anywhere. So this is going to be a process, and we shouldn't be held to, well, look how many you didn't win this time. Well, it's how many people we turned out. Right. It's how many ideas we get out there. It's what we got people talking about, whether it's single-payer health care or $15 minimum wage or whatever those policies are. And that perception changes. Am I making sense? I'm kind of going on a little bit.
Absolutely. And even though I was kind of less excited about who came out winning the primaries, I still think that it's very important that we go out and vote for the Democrats. And the reason being is because we've got some really good groundwork, like Tanya was talking about. We can't just depend on the candidates. We have to depend on the grassroots organization that's happening. And so with Michigan for Single Payer Healthcare, we're working directly with Yusuf Rabi, who has a bill currently in the House legislature for Michigan that would create a single payer healthcare system for the state of Michigan. Now, if we get Bill Schuette in, we have absolutely zero chance of that going anywhere.
Right.
And because the Democratic primary, healthcare was the focus, thanks to Abdul al-Sayed. I mean, he really made single payer a real talking point of that primary. It's already in Gretchen Whitmer's head.
Right.
So if we have Gretchen Whitmer as our governor and we keep pushing through Michigan for single payer with this bill, we might be able to make something happen. And even if she's not on board with it, because we know, her dad was the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is the major health insurance company for the state of Michigan. I mean, she doesn't want to put her family out of a job. Like, I get that. But here's the thing, if she wants to do what's best for the entire state of Michigan and the people of Michigan, and we can get so many legislators on board with single payer, we can show up to her office and say, look at all these people, look at all these signatures that we have. I mean, that's like a huge movement, and she's going to be super pressured into turning her position to support single payer health care.
I think we'll be looking at the margin of victory,
Right.
So for example, is her margin of victory more than 340,000? How close to 340,000 is it? Because that's how many votes Abdul al-Sayed got in the primary.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to be able to see how much she needs the progressive movement in order to win re-election, assuming she wins this time, which it does look like she's going to win. And we need to use that to pressure not just her as the governor, but Democrats up and down the ticket in terms of which directions the polity wants to move, and especially the polity that's likely to vote for Democrats at all. Because there are a bunch of those 340,000 people actually that are not going to vote for Whitmer because she says affordable access rather than universal single payer.
Right.
And that's a reality. I've brought this up before that I've asked her campaign a couple of times how they were going to deal with that. I never got any response other than, well, they're just going to vote for us. I mean, it was, and here's the thing, that's not necessarily not true, okay? But it's not true for a lot of people.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that aren't, and we're going to see some numbers to compare
Yep.
that are going to give us some ideas there.
Yeah.
Thoughts about any of that?
Well, I was just thinking as we talk about making the change, it's not going to happen in one election cycle.
Right.
Right. And we have to understand that the corporations, the power players, they've been at this for a long time. So we on the left need to be, I think, much more strategic and a lot less idealistic. Because sometimes, again, in our idealism for a better world, which is good in many respects, I think sometimes you have to also make a decision where it's about the do no harm, right? So I think, you're always going, I think people need to learn that, or not people rather, but as I guess, as we grow and as we develop, we see that a lot of the world operates in shades of gray. It's not black and white all the time. So, but we have to be smart, we have to be strategic, and we have to know that, yes, this is not the ideal, but this is a long game, and we have to be looking to make positive changes as we move forward with each election cycle, and not allow an election cycle that can set us back decades. Right. So I feel like with Schuette, what's at stake is with Schuette, you're going to go back many, many years, and it's going to, like you said, there's not going to be any hope of any sort of positive Medicaid expansion, any hope for water justice, any hope for environmental protections. I feel like all of that is going to just, it's on the verge of collapse. It's just going to go, it's just going to collapse. So again, we have to also sometimes think, do no harm. And that's how we have to, I mean, a vote is a vote. It's not, it doesn't mean it's not your necessarily a moral position. You know, it's not about your character. It's not defining you. It's about making a decision to do no harm or to do less harm sometimes. And I know many people don't like to characterize it that way, but it is an important piece of this. If we don't, because we have to be looking long term. We can't just be looking at it short term. So
I like to use the analogy where if you think about the government broadly, local, state, federal, etc., the government broadly you can think of as a big machine. It's a system that's intended to process input into public policy, and that machine is going to do that whether we vote or not, because the way that the voting system is designed. Doesn't matter how many people vote. What matters is who gets the most votes in a particular election, even if it's not a majority in most cases. Okay, so we have a system that's designed to favor the largest plurality, whether that's a majority or not, and of the people that actually go and vote. Okay, so not going and voting is just saying, well, whoever shows up is going to decide the direction of that big machine. Now, part of the problem is a lot of people don't want to show up because we don't have very much control over the big machine. The vote doesn't help us move it that much. And so one of the things that I think is really at stake in this election is, are we going to go further towards a system where we have more control over it, such as in Michigan with Prop 2 and Prop 3, you know, Prop 2 for for taking partisanship out of gerrymandering. We're still going to draw districts, but we're going to take the partisanship out of it. And Prop 3 making it easier to access the ballot, number one, and be registered, and making it more efficient to fill out the ballot. I mean, straight ticket voting is just really about efficiency in filling out the ballot. So I think that question of, are we going to go farther towards, we're going to change the machine, change the interface to our machine of government to be more responsive, more easily controllable by the people as a whole, or are we going to go in the other direction? And I think that Trump's rhetoric and the Republican rhetoric behind him is all about going in the other direction. That's what birthrights, he wants to talk about removing birthright citizenship. That's a voter suppression tactic. That's, we don't want people that we don't like to vote. We don't want, Trump and the Republicans don't want people to vote who they know are most likely not going to vote for them. So this is a key thing that's at stake. And how do you see the Democrats reacting to that in a way that's going to help energize people who aren't already voting?
Unfortunately, I don't see that happening from the Democrats. I actually see it happening from the progressives only. Because I have been slammed by the Democrats over and over and over again with this progressive movement and Michigan for Revolution, and it's more of a threat. They say, you don't vote for Democrats, then if the Republicans win and we get this, then it's your fault. And it's not an inspiring message. Where the message that I've been giving people is, so the people that we wanted to represent us in our district, in our state, in our country, they may have not won the primary, and that's disappointing. But like you were saying, if we don't vote and we just sit back idly and say, well, there's no one that I feel inspired to vote for, so I'm just not going to vote, then you let the corporations win, because they're the ones that are pouring massive amounts of money into these negative ads, and that's what they want. They want you to stay home. They don't want you to vote. And so if you go out and you vote for the lesser of two evils, then we're at least making that progress, and we're not taking 3 giant steps back. So that's kind of the message that I've been giving progressives. Yeah, there's no one really inspiring for you to vote for, but at least it's a step in the right direction to vote for the Democrat. And because if Schuette then wins, then we take 3 giant steps back. So if you want to keep this movement going and you want to keep it alive, this is the way that we've got to do it.
Well, I agree with you. But we have to also, the other thing is what the Democrats are not realizing, and even I think sometimes we as progressives have to keep in mind that this system has disenfranchised so much of the population for so long, for decades now. And people really don't see, well, if I vote, it changes. If I don't vote, if I vote, it doesn't change. If I vote, it doesn't change. So there is a huge level of apathy, of disenfranchisement, of overall, like we have to know that, we have to understand that people are hurting really badly. And unfortunately, some of the people that are hurting the most are also going to be the ones that hurt even more if this election goes to the Republicans, or many of these races go to the Republicans. But at the same time, people are at a point of being so demoralized and so burdened by their everyday that it's very hard to, kind of rah, let's go vote. It's hard to get that message across. So we have to really have a lot of empathy for those people who are suffering. I don't think we've yet found a way to convey the message, progressives and Democrats alike. Democrats definitely not, but progressives too, sometimes, of how do we encourage people to take that step, but in a way that's not sanctimonious, in a way that's showing empathy for their situation and their circumstances. Like, I know that, like, Flint and Detroit, and Detroit now, but it's, they don't have clean water for their children. And then you go and you're asking them to vote, and yes, they've suffered the worst under the Snyder administration, but at the same time, it's like, I'm worried about my, about the health of my children, about my own health, about, having to work more than 2 jobs sometimes in order to make ends meet for my family. So how do we, and these people at the same time are the people that need to be at the forefront of a movement for justice. So how do we, so I feel like that's hard. Like, we have to create, yes, we definitely want to have a lot more wins for the Democrats because we think that's going to push the machine in a way that'll lead to towards democracy. But at the same time, how do we, we have to empathize with the unfortunate circumstances that have occurred for these people over decades. So I don't know, how do you reconcile that, So that's something that.
So this is a discussion that's been on the left for a long time. Do we support what we see as basically a Band-Aid or a not as bad as, or do we fight that and say, well, we're not gonna participate in that that kind of with that kind of a candidate or with that kind of a party that isn't really gonna move the torch forward, so to speak. And I think that one of the things that this election has shown so far is that the people that are really standing forward and being the thought leaders, being the idea people behind where we ought to go, and that that a lot of the candidates in the Democratic Party are really getting behind. For example, a lot of candidates getting behind Medicare for all, despite what we were just talking about the Florida governor's race. So we have built up a cadre of progressive thought leaders that are at the top of a lot of tickets, whether that's Guillaume or Gillum.
Gillum,
I'm sorry. For some reason, I have a problem with names. So Gillum. And Ocasio-Cortez, and certainly Sanders, other people across the country. And one of the things that we need to start thinking about is how to talk to some of these more centrist Democrats, maybe maybe who are not, particularly in high positions of power, but rank and file Democrats, and say, look, here are these are the thought leaders are the progressives. How are we going to get to build that bench? Because that's the bench that's turning people out. And if we want to win, not just this time, but next time and the time after that, that's what we have to do. And I think we have to reach out to those people and say, these are the facts on the ground, and how are we going to work together to move that forward?
At the same time, I see the challenge to that being that a lot of these centrist Democrats are also beholden to a lot of corporate entities and interests. So it's like, well, yeah, this is where the people are going, but then you have these corporate actors that are kind of pulling you, and you're kind of stretched in these two different directions. So where do you go? And I don't know. I don't know how. I guess we have to, I think, for all of our gains in the last, 2 years, or for all of the work that's been done in the last 2 years, there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done to kind of pull these people in a direction and kind of get them loose from these corporate entities, right? So I don't, so that's kind of, so I feel like even talking to them right now is not, you have to really just kind of pry them away. So how do we pry them away? We need to be more forceful. And when I say more forceful, we need a lot more people on the ground kind of determining whether they stay in office or not. So.
And that's kind of something I think that I learned from this past election cycle. I think one of the things that we can encourage progressives to do is to just remind them to stay really active in the primary elections, because that is where the majority of change can happen, is in the primary elections. But what I've learned from this past election, that it's still all about the money, and the races that we lost were mostly because we couldn't raise enough. It wasn't that we didn't have enough volunteers. It was that we just couldn't raise enough money to get our message out. And
do you mean in terms of like being able to buy TV time, or
buy TV time, and be able to just, because the money is how you get endorsements. And there, in the 8th district primary, for instance, we had a really, really great progressive candidate in Chris Smith. And he should have gotten the endorsement from the the League of Conservation Voters. He should have gotten the endorsement from Sierra Club. I mean, he was far more progressive on environmental protections.
And just let me say, you're actually a PhD student in,
in fisheries and wildlife.
In fisheries and wildlife, so this is your area. You know where the stances were. So.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, but when you go to all of these organizations to ask for their endorsement, the first question that they ask you is, well, how much have you raised so far? And we still have this problem with organizations thinking that, okay, you didn't raise enough money, so I'm not going to give you more money. I mean, I feel like it goes back to a high schooler trying to get a credit card for the first time. And you can't get a credit card unless you've established credit, but how do you establish credit without the credit card? So it's
it's like these otherwise progressive organizations, okay, are saying you have to go out and get that corporate backing, or you have to figure out some way to raise enough money in small dollar donations in order to get our money. And our money is going to go to the person that we think is going to have the best chance of winning. And we're going to measure that essentially based on how much money you've raised otherwise. And that's again one of the pieces that I think is key to what's at stake in this election, is how we perceive the political process and how we think about changing it and how we're going to, as a progressive movement, work to change that in the future. What can we do to combat some of that?
Yeah, that I don't have an answer to. And I think that's kind of the looming question right now. I think the one thing that we can learn from this election is by looking at the data. And because a lot of, analytics out there, that's what they do. They look at the data and then they use it to try and predict what's going to happen for the next election cycle. But I think that the data is changing. It's you can't really count on what's happened in the past anymore. You have to kind of look to the future and see what's happening as far as the new generation that's starting to vote. And I think that's where we need to be focusing. Look at the progressive candidates that actually made it in. What is the demographic of their votes in the general election compared to a more moderate candidate? Are the moderate candidates, are they getting the votes mainly from the greater than 70-year-old generation? Because if they are and they're not getting the younger generation, then that's something that we can learn from. From this election. I think that can really help us in the progressive movement moving forward.
Right. I think on the radio coming here today, I actually heard a new poll out that said that somewhere, depending on the state, it sounded like I'd have to go back and look it up. But something like 30 to 50% of the 18 to 29-year-olds are enthusiastic about voting this time, which with the last presidential election, it was under 20%. It was 19 something, 19 point something. So that's a huge difference. But I also want to make the point that, to a large extent, what matters is continuing to push our message. Because I don't think there's any question that the data shows that our message is a winning message.
Yes, it is.
And when we get resistance to that, what we're getting resistance from is the center that's used to that's used to being a certain way, and looking, and really one of the key problems is they only look at half the electorate, which is approximately half the electorate, that is the electorate that's most likely to show up over the past decades. And that's the shift that's happening, is that we're getting people that aren't in that 50%. That's it seems to me that's the only way that we move our country forward, is by getting to a point where we regularly turn out 70-80% of the population to vote. And to do that, we have to show them that we really have solutions. And progressives have solutions. Conservatives on the right and centrists and establishment Democrats don't. They have all the things that they've been doing for the past 50 years that haven't worked, except to fight each other. So
I also think it's like we want to, now that we have this momentum going and we have a lot of people that are kind of slowly getting more engaged with the political system than before, you see a lot of, there's a lot of power and a lot of things happening locally. I feel like local politics, in certain races, we've always been kind of primed to pay attention to the presidential election or our congressional races, our federal, congressional races. I mean, state house, state senate, local courts, judicial appointments, school boards. I mean, there's a lot at play locally, and I think being an engaged citizenry is not just it's not an activism thing. It's a lifetime. It's a way of being.
Right.
And I think one of the big things that we have to do as a progressive movement is that as we build this progressive community and people that really feel like they identify with our values, that they're also an engaged citizenry, right? There's so many barriers of entry, and so much, and it's so hard to kind of figure out, like, who do I vote for locally? I feel like it's almost like an insider's club when it comes to local politics and local elections. So how do we kind of, decode that, right? How
Right.
do we make that, how do we break it down in a way so it's accessible to people in terms of like knowing what is affecting them, what kinds of things are happening around in their neighborhood, and demystifying. Yeah, that's the word
Sure.
I was looking for. The whole process. So.
Right, explaining how things work and why they work
Yeah,
that way,
yeah.
and how and what are the other ways that they could work.
Right.
Because that's one of the big things is that a lot of the time it's like this is what we've always seen, and
Right.
a lot of the time we don't end up thinking much beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to point out what you just described there, where we're keyed to think about the president and the senators and the governor and the House and the U.S. House, and then when it comes down to the state legislature, less so, and farther down, a lot of the times less so. Maybe mayor is a little bit more.
Yeah.
Think about that. That's all top-down thinking.
Right.
That's the way that our culture trains us to think, is that these are the most important things, but actually, in terms of a lot of what affects people on a day-to-day basis, like, for example, do you have clean water?
Right.
Is a local issue. That can, I mean, obviously, when we have a governor that doesn't believe in democracy and decides to institute as effectively a dictator over a democratic polity, then you have a different situation, and you see what happens when you have
Right.
authoritarianism in Flint. And they were just talking about somebody who's, doing it because of, fiscal issues. Well, whatever the reason is for having top-down control, you're going to end up with problems that way.
Right.
So we need to start thinking about local elections, building a bench for local elections,
Right.
and getting people to know as much about municipal policy
Yes,
issues
yes.
as about national policy issues.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important part of the political revolution that we've all been talking about. Most prominently Sanders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things is, how do you get people to care? One of the issues we were talking about is how to get our message out, without that corporate money. How do we beat the corporate money in politics, which has been quite a problem. And one of the things that we can do is host a town hall. Parks, free. You could say, I'm a candidate. I'm going to be at this park. You want to ask me any question that you want. And that's a very people-oriented process. But you still need to get the word out that you're going to be at the park at a specific time. So how do you do that? And we do have like local radio stations, and we do have local public media, but it seems like people don't watch those stations, or they don't listen to those stations.
Well, the people who do are already the ones that are mostly engaged.
Exactly.
Right.
So how do you reach your message out to the disengaged people, to the people who sit on their couch and watch Fox News or CNN for 3 hours every evening? They're not going to get that message. A lot of people, too, you can say, there's ways that you can put it in a local newspaper. Well, people don't really read the newspaper anymore. There's social media, but now you even have to pay for those advertisements.
Right.
So that's kind of the issue that we're facing here.
Yeah. I also want to mention, again, even the way in which local politics is conducted or are conducted, there are so many, again, hurdles. If you're having, for example, there was recently a citizen oversight commission for, they wanted to basically create a citizen-led oversight commission. They created a task force from the citizenry in Ann Arbor to have oversight over the police department.
The police department,
Right. Sorry, I'm.
Yeah.
But then the mayor was able to come up with his own recommendations in spite of all the work that this citizen-led commission had done. And so I feel like so first of all, but these city council meetings, just as a case in point, these meetings would start like around 7 p.m. and they went into like 11, midnight, they were going on for 5 hours. I mean, if you have a regular 9 to 5 job, or if you're working 2 jobs,
Or you have kids at home.
or you have kids at home,
Right.
how are you going to attend this?
Right.
Right? How are you going to be a part of this process? So there's so many, if you need, look at our public transportation. It's non-existent.
Right.
Right? So people, many, in a lot of areas, they can't get to these meetings because they don't have a car.
Right.
And there's no like reasonable public transportation to get to any of these meetings. So I mean, there's so many of these barriers created locally to that really leave a lot of the citizenry out of the process. The people that have privilege and means are the ones that are able to engage many times in these in this local process. And that and again, the decisions are, unfortunately for many, are the ones that they're looking to benefit their own community, right? And sometimes that comes at the expense of communities that are lower income or less privileged, or communities of color.
Right.
So how do we, again, it's so again, there are all these barriers. How do we slowly dismantle these barriers? So it's not just a knowledge gap, but it's also like a matter of like means, right? So how do we make it more accessible?
Well, Michigan for Revolution only started, what, like a year and a half, 2 years ago? 2 years ago?
Yeah, December, late November, late November, early December of 2016.
Okay, so it's fairly a brand new organization, and the leaders within the organization are slowly getting their face and their name known within their communities, right?
Sure.
And I think that's where it starts. And yes, I think it's great that we had, a lot of Michigan for Revolution people show up and run for office this time. But I mean, remember, Bernie Sanders didn't even win his first election.
No.
He didn't win a second election. I mean, how many did it take until he finally
That's
won?
right.
So we can't just give up, because where it starts is just name recognition and being recognized in your community. So if you think about it in the long term, you're not just canvassing for that election.
That's right.
You're canvassing for the next election and the next election after that, because with each new person that you meet and you make contact with, they're going to know who you are, and they're going to know that you're the ones that are helping their community. So maybe 3 or 4 elections down the line, you will have enough support because people know who you are at that point. So maybe that's more like how we need to think about it.
I think that's absolutely part of it, because it's a process. It's not something that one election isn't going to solve the problems that we have. It's a process of many elections. And I understand that the right wing has done this very effectively for 40 years. It's partly how we got to this point.
Well, they use fear mongering, and we know that works.
Well, but here's the thing: is notice that a lot of their fear mongering, not all of it, and certainly not the subtext of it, but a lot of the overt fear-mongering, they've had, up until relatively recently, they've had it more under control than they did, say, pre-Nixon. So we created a culture that wouldn't tolerate that at the top of the ticket, okay? But what happened is that when the Democrats moved farther and farther to the right, they stopped standing up for unions in the same way that that they used to. They stopped being perceived as on the side of working people by a lot of folks. Reagan Democrats are auto workers and industrial unionists, et cetera, that here in Michigan, Monroe County. For example, and you saw them again in the Trump election. So these are long-term trends that are cultural, not just political, and the culture drives the politics. And we've. I think that's what we need to learn to look at these things as longer term issues that are going to take those kinds of 10, 20 years of repeatedly going out there and not just building name recognition for an individual candidate, but idea recognition for the ideas that we're putting out there that we're saying are solutions. Now, one of the objections from the left to this is, they'll talk about, if you do it that way, then you eventually get co-opted because you make too many compromises. Okay, and so what they're saying is that, like you said before, there's idealism versus immediate impact. And what a lot of people that are the kind of people that, for example, aren't going to vote for Whitmer. For some of the reasons that we mentioned before, for the healthcare reasons, for example. They're saying that if we do that, then we just leave behind the idealism. We never get back to it because we get sucked into this. That's the argument that Jennifer Kurland made on this program just a few weeks ago, essentially. And that if you don't do it all or nothing, then you're never going to get there because you'll get co-opted. So how do we deal with that? How do we make sure, and how do we communicate? How do we make it clear that even if we're doing this, we're pulling this lever on this election, that what we're doing is more than one election, that it's a series of elections, it's a long-term plan, and we're not going to get co-opted. How are we going to? How do we do that?
Well, we were talking about strategy earlier, that this needs to be more like a strategical move, right? So something that Michigan for Single Payer Healthcare is doing, we decided to kind of take a back seat for the past couple months so we can focus on campaigning for candidates, because a lot of people within our movement are very involved in electoral campaigns as well.
Sure.
And so we kind of had this thought that, there's an election every 2 years, right? So in the off year, in the odd years, we focus more on the issues, and we really put a lot of energy into our organization for the movement. And then through that movement, we'll evolve these candidates that embrace those movements. And so it's just this constant progression forward. So we have a plan that directly after the election, we are going to get all together, the board is going to get together, and we're going to make a plan for meeting up until about January, and what our plan is going to be for 2019. And it's going to be, and one of the things on our docket is to have conversations with the newly elected House in Michigan, and have conversations about Medicare for All and the bill, it's called My Care, that Yusuf Rabi has proposed. And we are just going to keep talking about it and talking about it and talking about it with them. And we're not going to let them, we're not co-opted by anything. We're still pushing for our movement. And so we think that if we focus on that right after the election, then we're still moving forward. We still have our ideals.
I agree with you. I think one of the key things is to be able to get a bunch of the people on the left to believe that.
Yeah.
And whether they choose to join with it or not is a different question. But I think we have a job on the left to convince people that that's what we're up to. And
viewers out there, we're doing it.
Yeah. No.
Come join us.
Right. I mean I think that we do that by showing them that we're doing it, by being out there, by organizing events, by having town halls, bringing in speakers, moving the public conversation, which is part of the reason for this show, is to move that public conversation, have that conversation publicly. But that's a really key point, because that's the argument that the left has been having among ourselves for decades, for 100 years really. So that, I think that's a key part of it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to add also, I think an important thing that sometimes I feel like we do get into that silo organizing. Like the people who are doing politics are over here, the people that are on the ground, doing union organizing or workers' rights stuff are over here, people that are organizing for better public schools are over here. So we need to somehow, I think what's very important, again, in periods where, we're not all kind of pushing around or like moving to achieve a certain electoral result, we need to be having conversations across all these different nodes. And we need to be working as much as we can, collaborating and building community, trust, and coalitions. And I think building trust between a lot of these organizing silos is extremely difficult work, but it's extremely essential work to our long-term success, because again, there are communities that have suffered injustice long before 2016, have suffered for decades. We know the amount of like the Black community, what they've gone through, the LGBTQ community, what they've gone through, the Native community. Again, these are decades and decades of systemic oppression, and then coupled with socioeconomic injustice. So we need to be having a lot of, there has to be a lot of trust and communication between these different organizing efforts, these different groups that are working to, some of them are just, trying to, some of these community organizations are about really making it to the next day, because of the amount of violence and cruelty that their communities do face on a daily basis. So we need to, so I believe that a big part of our success is going to be creating coalitions that are multiracial and that extend across different socioeconomic classes, and that's an ongoing conversation, and that the process of building trust is an ongoing one, but a difficult one.
And I think coming back to our topic, as we have to wrap up here. So I want to get final thoughts on this. But to me, what you've just, a big part of what you just said is that we have to build our networks and strengthen those networks, partly so not to communicate and to organize towards these particular goals. And one of the things to me that's at stake in this election is coming out of it, what's going to be the argument about what's effective for organizing for the next one. And I think we're going to get a bunch of pushback from establishment folks who are going to say, well, look at how many of our folks won.
Right.
That's not the conversation that we need to have. The conversation that I think we need to have is what were where were we making the most gains? How were we bringing the most new people out? What are the ways that we're connecting with people and organizing with people to change the political landscape, to change what's possible in politics. I really think this is to me, this is the tagline for the progressive movement, is that politics is the art of changing the possible. And I think that's, seeing that as the vision is one of the things that's at stake in this election. For me, I think that's a key part of it.
So the immediate next steps are obviously, starting this coalition building and having these conversations. But as far as elections go, the Michigan Democratic Party is going to be electing a new chair in February. Michigan for Revolution has been really successful in really infiltrating the Michigan Democratic Party.
Not nefariously. We were quite clear about what we were doing. We weren't hiding anything.
And that's what I love about Michigan for Revolution. It's a completely transparent organization. It's what drew me into it. And there's some rumors that Abdullah El-Sayed is possibly going to be running for chair, potentially.
I've heard both ways. I think the answer is no.
Okay. But if it's still on the docket, I mean, we still might even have another very progressive person that we can run as chair. So I'm thinking, like, in the immediate future, if we can kind of transform the Michigan Democratic Party, I think that really is a step in the right direction. Because right now, we know, and this is no secret, the UAW owns the Michigan Democratic Party. And they kind of do everything that the UAW wants to do. And I'm not anti-union. I'm not. But I'm for having a collective voice and not having one outside organization control the Democratic Party of Michigan. And so there's room at the table for the UAW. I just don't want them calling all the shots. And that seems to be what's been happening in our past with the Michigan Democratic Party. And so to have a leader in there that says, no, we need to bring other organizations to the table. Other organizations need to have a voice within the Democratic Party. I think that can do a lot, even in a short period of time.
I absolutely agree. I think that's something that that we need to engage with them more. I've had some good meetings with folks from all across that spectrum about moving the party in a more democratic direction in terms of how it works internally, how the rules work, et cetera. We had a really great movement with the rules, not nearly everything that we wanted, but we made a lot of changes that went through State Central Committee on March 17th. That was a big victory for the progressive movement that a lot of people don't know about.
Yeah.
But we'll be covering more on this show, particularly after the election, as we get into the next cycle of Democratic Party elections. Any last words?
I think it's just to continue organizing, not just within, but with that, like outside.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think a big part of any of the successes we had inside the party, or even electorally, is because of like a lot of the organizing that was done outside with, you know, average everyday citizens, you know, who really stood up and said, you know, enough is enough. We're not going to, you know, tolerate any more of these injustices. We're going to come together, and we need to stop, you know, our all the assaults on our environment, our health, our wealth. You know, so it's just about kind of continuing that outside organizing. I think it's key, but it also has to be connected to certain political goals. And then, you know, I mean, it's an entire system, right? There are a lot of different levels of the system, a lot of different ways in which the system wages violence and injustice on people and profits from them, right? So we look at the, you know, again, I think an organization recently started by Sean King, I think it's called Real Justice PAC, where they're focusing on local, is it DA races or district attorneys,
Wow.
because they have a lot of say in terms of the kind of cases that are brought forward in terms of police violence and such. So I know we have to wrap up, so but basically it's just this idea of continuing the fight and the organizing outside, and then bringing that together strategically so we can take on battles against the establishment that when we're in the establishment is hurting people.
So I think to sum all of that up, what we're saying is vote strategically to protect what we've got and try to keep as many people safe as possible, and organize to build momentum so that over the course of multiple election cycles we can move things forward.
Exactly.
And be sure to demonstrate that we're doing both of those things, not just one or the other.
Yeah, and we'll be here. We're not going anywhere.
We're not going anywhere. That's
right.
right. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll be back next week with another episode.